Well, good evening. I'm Alan Jackson, and welcome back to Nashville. Whether you've dabbled in artificial intelligence or not, there's no question that AI is here to stay. Some people think it's the best way to invest in their future for work and investments. Others are afraid it might be so effective that it will replace them in whatever they do. CEOs seem to believe it can raise productivity and create must-have products. Doctors think it could help them diagnose patients with greater accuracy. And some media outlets think it could create an entirely new viewership on a global scale. For example, Alan Jackson Now could be translated into Spanish, Japanese, Hindi, German, Arabic, any of the other 7,000 languages worldwide. Imagine that. My sermons at World Outreach Church could reach the world in an entirely new way. In fact, we're already broadcasting them in Arabic to millions of people in the Middle East, thanks to AI. No subtitles. I'm actually look like I'm speaking Arabic. I didn't even go to school. Well, all the big tech names are getting in. Sam Altman with his OpenAI, Mark Zuckerberg, Sundar Pichai from Google, Elon Musk. Are they doing it for the money or to help create a better world? Maybe both. It's time to call in the expert, someone with human intelligence from Texas. George Seay is the chairman of Annandale Capital in Dallas. Welcome back, George.
Thank you, Alan. Good to be here. I think a lot of people in the Northeast and on the West Coast might think that intelligence and Texan is an oxymoron, but I'll take the compliment. Thank you.
Well, we'll help them learn differently today. President Trump wants to go big on AI to drive the economy, but the Chinese just announced their version of it called DeepSeek, and Wall Street took a serious drop. Are we already in a position where we have to play catch up with the Chinese?
We're not. They probably stole a lot of the chat GPT technology to get where they're at, and they claim they've only spent about $6 million developing this, but I think that's the end cost. I think there were probably several hundred million of costs that came before that, so we are definitely not behind the Chinese, but the Chinese is our fierce rival, and they're going to try to beat us at everything. They're going to fail miserably at most, if not all things, but that's what they're going to try to do. And you know, it's funny, I keep getting reminded of the old cliche that there's only two certainties in life, death and taxes, but that's not really true. There's a third certainty, which is change. Things are going to change, and if you think about all the change we've seen just in the last 40 or 50 years, computers, software, the internet, automation in our manufacturing, and now AI. I mean, it's just a gigantic change, and I think the market volatility you see is just people being frustrated and uncertain at where we're going. There's a lot of uncertainty right now, and people sell first and ask questions later when they're confused.
Well, whether or not it's a good stock market investment, President Trump is convinced that we need to invest in it big time to stay ahead. Listen to his recent comment about the launch of something called Stargate.
Together, these world-leading technology giants are announcing the formation of Stargate. So put that name down in your books, because I think you're going to hear a lot about it in the future. A new American company that will invest $500 billion at least in AI infrastructure in the United States, and very, very quickly, moving very rapidly, creating over 100,000 American jobs almost immediately.
Give us some practical examples of how it might help businesses grow and why the market is so enthusiastic about it.
Well, it's just such a pioneering, blaze a trail kind of new sector that didn't even exist several years ago. It's astounding how fast it's moving, and it's even more astounding the kind of money that's being thrown around at this. You look at Mark Zuckerberg, who was a far left, fierce opponent of Donald Trump 4 years ago. Now he's cozying up to him as his buddy, and Meta announced on their fourth quarter earnings about a week ago that they're going to put $65 billion into AI capital improvements and infrastructure just next year, I believe. I mean, the amount of money that's being spent is crazy. And you have all these data centers that are coming in to increase the capacity of this sector tremendously in the coming years. And that's going to create a lot of power. And luckily, we have all the energies required to power those data centers in the form of natural gas. So it's going to be really good for the energy industry. It's going to be really good for the construction industry. It's good all the way around in terms of building a brand new sector that we're going to be the world leader in yet again.
Well, this may be a tough one. While I recognize that a computer is only as good as the people who write the software that runs it, do you think that AI will ever be able to think better than the average human? In other words, do what we're trying to do now simply with our God-given brains, a calculator, and smart mentors with experience to pass down?
Well, you know, years ago, you had a computer-generated chess program that IBM created, able to beat Garry Kasparov, the world champion in chess, and everybody was astounded when that happened. And I'm sure there's certain things that AI will be able to do from a rapidity of computation or thought process and all that that's very hard for humans to replicate. But I have this old-fashioned belief that God created humankind in a very unique way, different than all the animals and different than all the technological improvements and everything else. So I think there will be things humans can do that just can't be replicated in the technological world. I think there'll be a lot of people who would fiercely argue me that point, but I feel very strongly in it.
Let's move to the president's tariff announcement. With just a few phone calls, the president has Mexico, Canada, and even China presenting solutions. So he's delaying any new tariffs for at least 30 days. China's still trying to push back a bit, but the Chinese leader has agreed to talk more, even as he ups his own tariffs. Trump made a deal with China during his last term, but they never followed through. This time with a weakened economy, China's likely to try to make something work. What are you hearing?
Well, a lot of flabbergasted people at the tariffs. It's really goes against free trade and improving the economy and growing the economy. It's a tax on everybody, so it slows everything down and grinds everything up a little bit. It's throwing a wrench in the gears of the economy. So I really disagree with tariffs. I don't believe the president's right in terming that it's a great tool in the toolbox to negotiate better deals with other countries. You did see Canada and Mexico come to a deal very, very quickly because they don't want this fight. They know it's bad for everybody, but you didn't really see China do that. China immediately slapped 15% tariffs on LNG and on coal exports to China, and I think they'll continue to fight. But to your point, which is very well made, China is bluffing right now. They're pretending like their economy's fine and they're still growing 5% a year. And that's a fraudulent number. They're not growing that fast, if at all. They may not be even growing at all anymore. And their debt problem is at least as bad as ours, if not worse, because we have such more extensive tax revenue to offset the deficit spending we've got in this country. So they've got real problems. And I would not be surprised for them to come to some deal with the Trump administration in not too long a period of time. I'm not sure they're so weak that if you just pushed on them barely, they'd fall over, but it's something approximate to that. They're in a bad spot.
Well, let's take a short break. Take a minute to write us an email about this discussion. You can send them comments at alanjacksonnow.com. We'll be right back. Well, let's move past AI and try to sort out what's going on with some of the more pressing economic issues. There's a big tax decision that has to be dealt with before the end of the year, or we're all going to be saddled with $4 trillion worth of additional withholding. And the president is on the record promising to cut some taxes. Remember what he had to say?
I'll be working with Congress to get a bill on my desk that cuts taxes for workers, families, small businesses, and very importantly, keeps my promise for a thing called, and I know you didn't hear anything about this, and I'm sure it had no influence on the state, the fact that we won this crazy, massive majority, a state that hadn't been won by a Republican in decades. But I'm sure you haven't heard, but we're going to get it for you. No tax on tips.
George, do you believe we can grow our way to a better place even with the debt and still cut some taxes?
I do, actually. I do think that some of the tax cuts are pretty minor in nature at this point, though. What he's really trying to do, and he's going to have every Republican vote in the House to do it, is extend tax cuts he already made so that we don't get a massive tax increase, because that would be a $4 trillion increase in taxes if we're not able to extend the 2017 Trump tax cuts. I think he will be successful at that. I think it's going to be very hard to pull off, though, because deficit hawks, mainly in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party, are very, very concerned about the $2 trillion in annual deficit spending we're doing right now, and cutting taxes doesn't help that a whole lot. So there's going to have to be kind of a grand compromise on not just extending tax cuts so we're not taxed $4 trillion further, but slashing spending. And I actually think at this point that's the more important battle, is what Doge and Musk and all his team are doing right now to try to eliminate terrible federal spending that's incredibly wasteful and bad for the American patriot who wants to see its government function well without driving debts to levels where we start to risk defaulting on our debt.
Well, you alluded to it. The congressional vote margin is very tight, and Democrats aren't likely to go along with any of what he proposes. And now there's a handful of Republicans from high tax state are insisting that the SALT tax deduction, stands for state and local taxes, be raised beyond the $10,000 limit approved in 2017. Do you think it should be raised so that people from higher tax states won't be penalized based on where they live?
I don't think it should be raised, but the president's for it, even though he was against it. Last time he got that slashed dramatically in terms of that tax break for blue states, but it's going to go through. That's going to be part of a compromise where you basically get a larger tax break for those blue states, because he's got a thin margin, and most of the margin is left in states like New York and some of the other blue states that have a few Republicans here and there, California, and they're all pushing for it really hard. He's going to cave on that one. He's going to give in.
Well, let's move to energy. You're in Texas. It's one of the big oil and natural gas states. If you're going to drill, baby, drill, as the president says, I'm assuming that it will help the economy rather than buying oil from other countries. Whether it's on a boat, a plane, or a train, everything is eventually delivered by a truck. Am I right about that?
That's exactly right. And Alan, the other thing that people don't completely understand, because we talk about energy independence and how the country was not energy independent and now we are, that's partially true. We're energy independent just because we have some allies that we can trust in that provide us enough energy to meet our demand. The U.S. consumes over 20 million barrels of oil a day in this country, closer to 25. And we can hit that number because the Canadians supply us a ton of oil, as do other friendly countries that we don't have to worry about. Not Russia, not Iran, not some of these countries that are our sworn enemies or adversaries at a minimum. So we definitely should keep that oil production high and natural gas production high, because those are some of our biggest assets from a natural resources perspective in this country. But we've also got to keep prices high enough on the commodities to where American companies that produce this can stay healthy. And I think the president is trying to drive prices down so low that he curries favor with the blue-collar worker that voted for him so overwhelmingly this time around. But the oil and gas companies can't stay in business if the price gets too low. So there's got to be a kind of a moderation in aspirations along those lines, and prices are high enough to where these companies can stay healthy, but low enough to where the consumer doesn't feel bit by it.
Well, to your point, what happens if the Saudis decide to raise their production levels?
It'll tank the commodity price, and I don't think they're going to do that. I don't think they would do it even if they wanted to do it out of spite, because the last time they did it out of spite with the Russians, they drove the price of oil to negative $37 a barrel because they flooded the world with supply right as the pandemic came along and demand plummeted at the same time. And it's rumored that the Saudi budget can't be break even for them unless oil's at $90 a barrel, and we're nowhere near that today. We're at 70, even though OPEC Plus is keeping several million barrels of oil a day off the market. So they're really in a quandary right now. They've got to keep that price above 70 to even have a chance of hitting their budget. So the likelihood that they're going to flood the market with oil again is close to zero, I think.
Well, for a moment, I want to promote you above Annandale Capital. If the president called you tonight and asked you what he should do to get things on a better track, what would you advise?
Well, I appreciate that. I think that he's getting almost everything right. I don't know what you all hear from friends and colleagues these days in terms of reviews of the first couple of weeks, and that's all it is the first couple of weeks. But what I hear mostly is that it's highly entertaining to watch all this stuff. It's very different than anything we've seen ever before, including the president's first term. There's just so much action, and they're doing things so quickly. It's very entertaining. I tell people that are troubled by it because they're either moderate or liberal, or they just are bothered by Trump, to just get out your popcorn and your Coca-Cola and go sit in the stands and enjoy the show, because it's quite a show. And I think the things he is doing from a DOGE standpoint at cutting the government back and also initiating pro-growth business strategies that he's employing are all very, very good. And I think going around the world and challenging our friends and enemies both to behave themselves better, and from a friend standpoint for NATO and all its member countries to spend more on defense, it's all good. And one other thing we haven't covered yet from a national security standpoint is he's really encouraging us to dramatically expand our missile defense capabilities in Alaska and on the West Coast. Right now, we're basically set up to defend against an ICBM intercontinental missile attack from North Korea or Russia or one of the other China countries that have that kind of capability. But we've got to be able to fight off all sorts of different missile attacks, including hypersonic missiles that go at least 5 times the speed of sound. And I'm very encouraged to see him do that. That's been left wanting for a long time, and improving the technology and modernity of our U.S. Defense Forces is imperative. And we got to get our budget under control to be able to spend that kind of money on defense to pull that off. So he's got his fingers in a lot of the right pies, and it should have, for the most part, most things turn out well with all he's doing.
Well, George Seay, it is always wonderful, and it's a learning experience to have you on. I hope you'll stay in touch. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate it.
If you're in Nashville, come by. You can have a seat here at the desk. I'll get smarter.
And I'd love to do that.
All right. Well, in a moment, some hopeful words about how we move forward. And there was no AI needed. They're going to be just my own thoughts. The conflict with China has come to the surface. From tariffs to the race to become the global AI superpower, the stakes are high. Well, I have a question for you. If the new administration can assess situations and allocate resources toward better outcomes for our nation, can we do the same for our families? When it comes to our financial health, are we faithful with the resources that are given to us? Here's a principle I'm going to ask you to consider. God is the owner of all things, and we're just temporarily handling his resources. 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 2 says, it's required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. I want to encourage you to take this approach. It's not my money any more than it's my time. I'm a servant of the King, and I serve at his pleasure. Let's stop and ask the Lord what he wants. What if we started saying, Lord, I'd like to please you? See, I think we have this false imagination that if we collect enough resources, we can secure our future. I wish that were true, but it just isn't. I've been too many times to the hospital or in crisis situation with people who have tremendous resources, but it won't resolve the problems that are before them. We want to begin to orchestrate a trust transfer, incrementally putting our trust in God more than ourselves or the things that we can gather together. If we'll do that, we'll be secure no matter what turmoil the future holds, no matter what politician finds their way to Washington. God will secure our future. And with that, there'll be reason for hope more than despair every day, I promise. Well, I'll be back with your emails in just a moment. Thank you for taking the time to send us your emails. Your thoughts and opinions are important to us. Joseph from Virginia asked, we hear a lot about the separation of church and state, but I don't think people understand that's not actually in our Constitution. Can you share a bit more about what separation of church and state means? Well, you're right, Joseph, it isn't constitutional, but it has made its way into our body of law. Simply put, the idea, or the way it's been expressed in the public arena for a few decades now, is they want the church completely separate from the public square. I believe it's a mistake, it's erroneous. That wasn't the intent of our founders. That's clear from the Declaration of Independence forward. In fact, they were highly dependent upon the authority of Scripture in the way they put our government together. A mistake that I think Christians make is that we imagine that the only church involved is those that declare themselves of the Christian faith. I think for several years now we've had a formal religion in our government. It's a worldview, a set of values that they have forced into the heart of American culture and divided our families. From the LGBTQ community to DEI, those are all components of the fervency that goes with the religion, and the Christians have been banished to the sidelines. While those ideas have had government sponsorship and tremendous support, the church is going to have to change and wake up a bit. And then Ruth emailed, please have more information on Sudan. What we're hearing about the civil war is it's causing famine to all the people who are trying to live in that country. Even the UN can't do anything to help prevent this famine from destroying this country. These women and children are being destroyed in this civil war. Well, Ruth, you're right. Sudan is in a horrible condition. There's a war taking place there that has been on and off again for decades. There have been hundreds of thousands of people who have lost their lives, displaced, and the United Nations has not been able to bring a resolution. I had friends that lived in Rwanda during the genocide, and they referred to the UN as the United Nothing. In Sudan, that seems to be a pretty accurate description. Prayer helps. Let's start with that, and then we will watch for ways that we can make a difference. If you missed the broadcast of the program, you can go to our YouTube channel and find it at your convenience every evening. Make sure you send your emails to comments@alanjacksonnow.com. From all of us here in Nashville, thank you for joining us tonight, and have a wonderful evening.